We'll begin with the Mishnah on Mem Amud Beis. It's page 12 in the Maram Khaim's book. After the Mishnah establishes one of the instances in which Shakal Nia B'dvarei is said, in the Lashon of the Mishnah, Al Davar She'ein Giduloi Min Ha'aretz, the Mishnah then goes on to list cases where the brachos shahakoil, not because that's the appropriate bracha specifically for this item, but because there is something exceptional about this item that makes its bracha be shahakoil. The first is chaymetz, which, as the Rishonim discuss, is an issue of consuming something which is not a normal dark davar shedarkei lechoil. And the second case that the Mishnah brings in that category is noivlois. Noivlois, Rashi says, will be explained in the Gemara. The Gemara brings a brisa that has a similar structure to the Mishnah. First, the brisa brings the din that dover she'ein giduloi min ha'aretz requires a shahakoil, and the Gemara then lists the brisa lists a number of items under that category: basar behemas chayav oifois, dogim, cholov and beitzim, gvina, and so on. Then, similar to the Mishnah, the brisa then lists a number of items whose brachos shahakoil because there's something exceptional to them. And under that category, the brisa lists pas she'ipsha, a pas which becomes mu'upash, a pas which becomes in some way rancid, al hayayin shehikrim, and there's a machlokes exactly how to understand what the case of yayin shehikrim is, v'al tavshil she'ovar tzurasai, and again we'll see the exact definition of tavshil she'ovar tzurasai is subject to machlokes harishonim. So we have in the Mishnah a list of instances where the brachos shahakoil, chaymetz, noivlois, and goivoi, and we have in the brisa pas she'ipsha, yain shehikrim, and tavshil she'ovar tzurasai. So if we go a little further in the Gemara, when the Gemara discusses what the case of noivlois is in the Mishnah, so the Gemara brings a machlokes, my noivlois. Reb Zera v'Rabbi Ilah, machlokes between two Amiroim, Reb Zera and Rabbi Ilah. Chad Omar bushlei chamra, v'chad Omar tamrei de zika. Now, tamrei de zika is clear in the Gemara that means tamarim which have not been fully ripened on the tree and have been thrown off the tree by the wind. That's tamrei de zika. Rashi says shal ruach meshiram. In the case of bushlei de chamra, we'll come back to this. There is a machlokes harishonim exactly how to define bushlei de chamra. But Rashi says bushlei de chamra means kimay srufei chamra shebishlam besarfam hachoim v'yovshu utmarim hem. Bushlei de chamra means tamarim that have shriveled under the heat of the sun. Now, what's the reason why those noivlois don't have the bracha of ber priya eitz but have the bracha of shakal nia b'dvarei? So, in the Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara, Rashi finds implicit in the Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara what the reason is. The Gemara asks that according to the Manda Omar that it's just Tamrei de Zika, so why is the bracha not Bari Prihaitz? The Gemara says, Elo Manda Omar Tamrei de Zika, Shahakoil Bari Prihaitz Meboy Lele Beruche. Rashi Dibra Mascha Prihaitz Boy Beruche. Rashi explains Shaharei Loi Nishtanu Lekilko. The reason why the bracha it should be Bayer Priyaitz and not Shahakoil is because Rashi says it wasn't altered lekilkul in a way that is considered kilkul, that's when it's considered a denigration. Now, implicit in Rashi is that the reason why the Gemara didn't have the same question why bushlei de chamra shouldn't be Shahakoil but should be Bayer Priyaitz implies that the reason why bushlei de chamra is shahakoil and not ber priyaitz is because bushlei de chamra on nishtanu lekilkul. Now, this lashon of Rashi of nishtanu lekilkul seems to be very vague. We've had previously in a number of sugyas and ketzad mevarchim the concept of ishtani. The Gemara in Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, for example, we have ishtani leiluya, and in contrast we have ishtani legreusa. The concept of kilkul is something that is unique to this sugya. This is the first time in which we find the Rishonim referring to the concept of niskalka, something which has been damaged, something which is makulkul, something which is no longer intact. And the question then is how to define, based on this lashon of Rashi, what the concept of noivlois being exempt from the bracha bar 8 and denigrated to bracha shakel. What's the point? Is the issue just another case of ishtani? And Rashi is saying it's not just ishtani legreyuso, but it's ishtani to the extent of kilkul, which means because they are bushlei the chamra and been burnt in the sun, so therefore the kilkul means the object has been altered from ordinary tsuras pri to become something else. And because it's not pri, therefore the bracha is shakoil. Therefore the ikra emphasis would be the concept of ishtani. Or we can read Rashi a different way. That in terms of the object itself, perhaps the object isn't so dramatically altered. The ishtani is not similar to ishtani liluyo, ishtani legreis of the Gemara Daf Chavav. But there's a specific process or a specific alteration or change which is called kilkul. And kilkul is something destructive. The pri or the item has undergone something which is destructive to it. And that itself may be a reason why bracha should be shahakoil, because on something that's makulkul, one doesn't make a bracha. Similar, a broad analogy would be similar to the concept of Rabbi Yehuda that something that is a min klala ein mevarchim. What's the idea of a min klala? Something that doesn't represent bracha isn't eligible for bracha entirely. So perhaps we could say that niskalkel also means that something which has been denigrated isn't eligible for that same bracha because it's makulkul. It's not a davar mevurach. So to summarize, we have two ways to understand Rashi. Is the ikka point ishtani, which means we're comparing this to the SUGYAS on Daf Lamed Vav and other SUGYAS where we have a broad concept in brachos called ishtani, that the object is no longer a pri ha'etz, it's no longer what the object itself. Or is the ikka point the opposite? Perhaps it doesn't satisfy the criteria of ishtani, but kilkul is a specific concept that where the shinui that it's undergone is kilkul itself denigrates bracha. These are two possible approaches to understand this key concept. Now, Rashi applies the concept of nishtanu lekilkul to the case of noivlos. But as we said in the Braisa, we have that the Braisa brings a number of other cases whose bracha is also shahakoil. We had pas she'ipsha, yain shehikrim, tavshil she'avar tzuras. So the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, by extension, explains that the common reason,
put it on the screen,
for those items that the Braisa lists, pas she'ipsha, yain shehikrim, tavshil she'avar tzurasai, what's common to all of them is those have also undergone something called kilkul. So on the first page of the Mara Makaimis, on left-hand side, middle of the page, is copied the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav in Siman Reish Daled Sif Beit. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav, the Lashonei Hazov, summarizes the central concept of this part of the sugya. Noivlois, pas she'ipsha, etc. Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav.
I only put it on the screen. It's on this page of the Mara Makaimis.
Anything which was nishtana lekilkul, right? It's a quote from Rashi, nishtana lekilkul. Nishtane birchosai hamiyuchedes loy. Its bracha that should be applied to it changes. Umevarchim olav bracha hakoileles hakoil shehi shakol miya bidvarim. Kugoyin hapas she'ipsha v'tavshil shenishtanu tzurosai v'niskalkilu ma'at. So again, we have pas she'ipsha and tavshil shenishtanu tzurosai that have undergone something called kilkul. And then the Shulchan Aruch HaRav discusses the question of niskalkel legamrei ad she'einu roy la'achila, which is an entirely different question. So too zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav yain shehichmitz, which is the Shulchan Aruch HaRav's hachra in what yain shehikrim means. Is an extensive discussion in the Bach and the Taz exactly what yain shehikrim means. But the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says it means yain shehikmitz. It's yain that's begun to go sour. Then the halacha is again ad shebnei adam nishtoim nishtoisoi mevarchim olav shahakoil, because again, it's undergone a process called kilkul. So we have the Shulchan Aruch HaRav extending what Rashi says for the case of noivlois, which were the tmorim that were nisrach b'shemesh, The Shulchan Aruch HaRav extends that to those instances of the Braisa, of the case of Pasha Ipsha, Yain Hikrim, and Tavshil Sha'avatzuros. If we just go down further, we have the Lashon of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav in the Halachas of Birchas HaPeiros, where there in Siman Reish Beis Sitbol, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav summarizes the Halach of Noivlois. He says that there are two cases of Peiros that are not fully ripe. One case of Peiros that are not fully ripe are sometimes still eligible for Be'er Peiros. There's some cases like Noivlois, which are a Shahakos. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav, what distinguishes between the two? Both of them are not fully ripened. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav, B'med Var Mamurim Shemebarchim Al Peiros Ketanim, Shelo Nigma Bishulam Be'er Peiros. Oh, sure, with pleasure. You want to make a copy of mine? I'm sorry, it didn't come out on the screen. I'll just read out the brief lashon, and I'll give the sheet. Yeah. He says that's only if the peiros were nitlash mina ilon, such that if they would have been left on the tree, they would have ripened on their own. Meaning, there's nothing that occurred to the pre itself that arrested its process of ripening. But hanoivlois shehim peiros shenisrifu me'achoim, but noivlois which were burnt from the sun, v'noflu min oil, and then fell off the tree, kodim sheniz bashlu. And he goes on to quote a number of incidents. He says, end of the wide lines. He says the reason why I'm in Reish Beis Sivov, he says mevorcham aleim sha'akol niya b'dvaroi shehoyel v'nishtalshlu likilkul. Again, that same emphasis that Shulchan Aruch HaRav found in Rashi, the concept of nishtalku l'kilkul. He says nigru v'yordu mima'alosam li'inyan chashivus habracha. So again, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav opens for us this question: what does exactly it mean that because of nishtanu l'kilkul yordu michashivus habracha? Is that because it's no longer the object, or is it because kilkul itself is a reason why something shouldn't be eligible for bracha? So there are a number of places in the sugya where we can see kipshuta in the achronim that there may be a very basic machloikes achronim in this very question itself, with a number of practical nafkiminas lahalacha. We'll begin with the suffix of the Bir Halacha in the beginning of Siman Reish Daled. So in the Marmakoimis book, that is, for those who have the Marmakoimis book, it's in Reish Daled Sif Aleph. The Shulchan Aruch is on page 252 and 253. So just to briefly review the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch first lists basar and dogim, beitzim, cholov, and gvina. And then the Shulchan Aruch lists hashe ipsha. So the Bir Halacha, which you can see on page 253, at the very bottom of the page, it's Tavar Nifla that the Bir Halacha discusses. He says, V'da, the Mevur Barambam, it's clear from the lashon of the Rambam, the Kol Elu Sheberchoson Shahakoil, all those whose bracha lefonov is shahakoil, bracha achroino shalohen boirei nefashos rabbis. The general rule is that bracha achroino follows bracha rishayna. The only exception that we know to that is pasabol bekisnin, where the tchilas habracha, if initially there wasn't kviyas suda, the tchilas habracha would be boirei minim zaynos, and if one then was kviyas suda on the pasabol bekisnin, the bracha achroina will be a bracha of shalish, a bracha of birchas hamazon, which the Bir Halacha at the end of the piece will reference. But kipshuta, the klal is, as established from the Rambam, and you say that Varm is Mavur and Tamer Rishonim, that bracha Rishonim and bracha achroina follow each other. And the Bir Halacha is medayik, that in the case of Pasha Ipsha, because the bracha preceding Pasha Ipsha, the bracha lefonov is shakoil, the bracha shala achrov will be bar nefashos. Zok the Bir Halacha l'choira kevon da adayin chazila achila k'tzas. The basic klal in our sugya is that pasha ipsha or tapshal sheniskalkel cannot be inedible. It has to be edible, but not in the pristine form. So in that case, Zot the Bir Alocha, we're not speaking about a Dover She'ein Roy Lachila. If you have a Dover She'ein Roy Lachila, then we perhaps wouldn't even make a bracha of Shahakoil. So therefore, Zot the Bir Alocha, what's the reason why the bracha becomes Shahakoil? He says, De Bishloim Le'inin Birchas HaMoitzi Shehu D'Rabbanon Kevon D'Loi Chashivi, language of the Bir Alocha. Because a pas she'ipsha is no longer choshuv, omru she'yivorech rak Shahakoil. So the Olam will remember that when we learned the Sugya Naf Lamed Ches of Pasabor Bekisnim, we had a very similar svara in the Even HaOizer. That even if Pasabor Bekisnim is considered pas doiraisa, the reason why the bracha shelafonov is mezoinois is because even if it's considered in all dinei HaTorah to be pas, for example, we discussed being yotzei mitzvahs matzah with it, or being having a chiyuv of a froshes challah from it. But Chachamim were koiveya bracha rishona kefi chashivus specific to categories in legabe bracha, which doesn't necessarily follow through legabe other dinei HaTorah. So therefore, the Even HaOizer said the bracha lefonov could be bar minim mezonos despite the fact that it's passed. So Zot the Bir Alocha, we can't infer from our sugya that pas she'ipsha is really any different. Perhaps all it says in the din of pas she'ipsha is because it's nishtana lekilkul, so therefore it doesn't have the chashivus of classic pas. So therefore the chachomim denigrated the bracha to shakol. Now the question then would be, so why didn't they put it down to a bar minim mezonos? Why did it have to go all the way to a shakol? Chayra, if it's dover sheroy la'achila and just lost the chashivus of pas, it shouldn't be worse than daisa. Question that perhaps if we have time we'll try and get back to. Very fundamental question. The fida mahalach of the Bir Alocha. But the Bir Alocha says that
it doesn't just go down a ladder. There's a chefza that's new a shahakol. If it's nishtana, it gets a shahakol.
Yeah, but the shadow is why should it be different than daisa? We'll see that the Bir Alocha is going to go on to say that all
made for daisa
lost chashivas pas.
Daisa is not
because of the kavanah of the oiseh.
Because the kavanah make daisa.
We'll have to see if that may be a svar. But this is a ha'ara that I got from Riata in the Bir Alocha. Zot the Bir Alocha, if that's true, then we come to the question of what should be benegea to bracha la'achrav. Now, by pasabol b'kisnim, we saw that the Even HaOizer says that the reason why the bracha la'achrav of pasabol b'kisnim can be me'ein shalish, despite the fact that it's pas d'oraisa, is because the Even HaOizer said to divide birchas hamazon into three separate brachas. That's a din d'Rabbanan. Midoraisa, one is yotzei birchas hamazon if one mentions bris, oretz, and Torah, etc., even within one large bracha. So therefore, the chashivos of birchas hamazon of a full shalosh, as opposed to me'ein shalosh, again is subject to chachomim being kevea the chashivos. So in pasabol bekisnin, the chachomim said me'ein shalosh is sufficient. Now, but the Rambam says the Bir Alocha tells us that what's the bracha la'acharav on pas she'ipsha? It's bar nefashos. Now, bar nefashos is certainly not a bracha shala'acharav with which one can be yotzei even the rudimentary requirements of birchas hamazon deraisa. So, frek the Bir Alocha kushiyat tzuma on the Rambam. How can the Rambam say, and this is the theme of the Rishonim, the Bir Alocha is just using the Rambam because the Rambam's language is clearest that the bracha shala'acharav is bar nefashos, but it's the stimas hapoiskim. If so, fact the Bir Alocha, the bishleim of the bracha shalafonov chachamim can be kaveh as is fit. Let the bracha be shakol. But the bracha shalachrav should be a bracha on pas. That's roy lachila. The bracha should be a bracha of shalish. And the Bir Alocha continues. If you go to the second column, he says, "V'chein muchach behedi b'simin reish beisif beizlinim bracha." Shmo achila u'mavarach alea bracha ru'ela u'beinyoneinu mishum deloi chashivu goru midargosa avaloi mistabro de mishum hochi yepoto legamre should be chayvim birchas hamazon. Zok der v'ula yesh loim enochanami the dafke shelo yachal kedei svia the chiyuv birchas hamazon shalu hu midrabanon ba'alm enochanami. If he only ate less than a kedei svia, he ate a kazayis or a kebeil, in which case the hamazon of shalosh is only drabanon, so hey mamru ve'mamru. But in the case where you ate kedei svia, where unquestionably the chiyuv is deraisa, zok the Bir Alocha chayil levarach birchas hamazon kevon da'al yedei adchat chozu la'achila. Says the Bir Alocha after mitchila birech shahakoil less lamba. It's like pasabol b'kisnin v'tzorich iyun l'maisa. So the Bir Halacha remains with the suffix. Now, the basis of the suffix of the Bir Halacha, as we pointed out from a number of Lashonos in the Bir Halacha, is because the Bir Halacha's assumption is that the entire reason why it's Gora from Bracha is just because it lacks the full Chashivas of Pas. But Be'etzem, it's a Chefetz of Pas, and we can't then escape from the question of the Beis Yosef and the Eben Oizer that whenever something is passed, b'negea to Kol HaTorah Kula, if one ate Kedei Svia, one is Chayav Birchas HaMazon D'Oraisa, and therefore one certainly cannot be Yotze with Bar Nefashos. It would only be a question if it should be Me'ein Shalosh or it should be full Birchas HaMazon. Now, just to expand the suffix of the Bir Halacha, Reb Shlomo Zalman, in his notes on Perek Ketzad Mevarchim, Reb Shlomo Zalman says that according to this tzad of the Bir Halacha, that if one ate pas she'ipsha, this is copied on the first page of the Maram HaKomis, on the right-hand side, just below the first paragraph, which is the Bir Halacha. So Reb Shlomo Zalman said, according to the Bir Halacha, l'chayra, the din should be that you should be mechayev netilas yadayim. He says, "V'tzorach iyun b'chayi gavna mechayev b'netilas yadayim." To hakevan sheroitz alechel kedei svia gam pasabo b'kisnin chayev b'netilas yadayim. Says if we're comparing the case of our Gemara to pasabo b'kisnin, even though pasabo b'kisnin has a mezainis and this only has a shakal, l'chayra to nachil of pas. So if one's going to go and eat, if one's intention is in the first place to eat a kedei svia of pasha ipsha, that would be chayev in the tilas yadayim. But only if I could possibly add an additional suffix. If someone is eating pasha ipsha kedei svia, does it have a din like kviya suda lalechem? In which case everything else is considered dvarim that are coming to me and it would include all the brachos. How do we look at this? The Reb Shlomo Zalman is pointing out is essentially the Bir Halacha has limited the din of pasha ipsha to say one thing. The chashivos of bracha rishayna it's not going to have. But legabi kol HaTorah Kula nishtana lekilkul, all nishtana lekilkul means is not broi for the bracha of hametzi lechem in haaretz. That is the way Reb Shlomo Zalman understands.
Otherwise, it's lechem.
Otherwise, it's complete lechem.
Is he telling you, by the way, it's off topic, but if you eat pastel kisnin a lot, you will keep until it's a diamond for pastel kisnin?
Yes.
So if you eat a lot of cake, you will keep until it's a
diamond. If you would be kavesin on it, then if your kavanah wasn't
not nizer in this at all.
Well, the island's not nizer to bake birchas hamazon afterwards either. So
and that's a steak of deraisa.
Correct.
And that's a steak of
deraisa. Correct. Yeah. The halacha chamura. Yeah. Halacha chamura. Yeah. Well, it's svia. It's a sheer svia. It's a sheer svia. Now we have a Mogen Avram that you could be saver on a combination of pas and
other stuff,
and other
right?
things. We have a Mogen Avram, so it's a break halacha. No, a kazai salamicha possibly not, because that Reb Shlomo Zalman agrees that the halacha agrees that kolzman that there isn't a chiyuv deraisa bracha la'achrav, then in a chanami, then we can say hey meim or hey mamru, and it will be different than pasal b'kisnin. And it's a very good point. The same way as we've been pointing out that the bracha shalafonav is a shakol, we can say the bracha then will remain by nefashos because that's the klal of the Rambam. The only case we can prove is the exception is kedei svia. Shlomo Zalman does point out, which again, this is the ha'ara which we've noticed, is that we find bar minim mezainis lefanov and shalosh achrov, but we've yet to find a shahakol lefanov and a shalosh la'achrov. That we haven't found. That's the Bir Halacha's chiddush nifla, that we can have a shahakol before and a birchas hamazon afterwards. So if anyone wants to faher children or eniklach at the Shabbos table, heicham motzino, a case where you can make a shahakol before and a birchas hamazon afterwards. The answer is it's a Bir Halacha in the case of pasha ipsha.
He said this is the only case in the Ganz Shulchan Aruch.
Again, but only
what's the svara problem with that? What's the svara problem with that?
What's
the big problem with making a shak on the birch of the mazon?
Because what's Reb Shlomo Zalman pointing out? Because Reb Shlomo Zalman is pointing out is that if the issue would be only an issue of chashivos, the bracha should be bar minim mezainis. That's really what Reb Shlomo Zalman is being nischabet in. Is that where do we find that something is nishtana lekilkul to the extent that it should be only a shahakoil, and yet it's fully considered an achila ru'uya of pas kedei that shafa birchas hamazon afterwards? This is the question. But homias, the Bir Halacha says that tzorach iyun l'maisa, but that's the din that he's mesupik in, and the Bir Halacha is clearly noted that in svara it should be chayiv in shalish afterwards. Now on this Bir Halacha, there's a piece of Reb Chaim Noah in K'tzei Shulchan, where Reb Chaim Noah brings this Bir Halacha. This is copied on top left of page 1 of the Maramakonis. He quotes the Bir Halacha, and he says, and we'll begin on the 5th line, the line that begins with the word Lamaisa after the period. He says, "V'nira poshut." It would seem to me in Svara poshut, de'ein shum tzorach iyun lamaisa. The Ketzos HaShulchan often writes, HaRav with Teikev, and he writes that v'nira poshut de'ein shum tzorach iyun lamaisa. Moshe Shmuel Shapiro used to say over a maisa that he remembers as a boy, that he was once outside the mikveh outside the mikveh, I guess, probably in Bate Randa, Bate Ungarn, I'm not sure.
Where?
Either in Bate Randa, Bate Ungarn, I'm not sure. And Yerushalayim. And Reb Chaim Noah and another one of the Alt Yerushalayim Yidden came out of the mikveh. And he said the derech of the Yerushalayim Yidden was to discuss the news of the day either inside the merchatz or immediately afterwards, places where you can't be mahar b'divrei Torah. So he described what the conversation between Reb Chaim Noah and the other Yidden used to be. One used to say, "Nu," and the other used to say, "Nu," and the other would say, "Nu." The whole conversation would be with the Ga'inus of Ramazan. It describes it as a boyhood memory. It's the Dmus of what Reb Chaim Noah was. It's one of the Yekirei Karton and the Dmus of towering gadlus. So he says, "V'nira poshut, de'ein shum tzorach iyun lamaisa." There isn't a mokum for a suffix. Why? Kevan dadin mefurish barambam. He quotes a lashon of the Rambam. The brocha achroina shaloi boyer nefashas rabbis. The Rambam is seisim. V'shar poiskim lo nechlik walav. Like we said, no poisik challenges that stimus Rambam that the brocha is boyer nefashas. Therefore, zok the Ketzos HaShulchan, ein mal istapik oid bezeh. If he would be oichel kadei svia, and it would be an issue of a sopik deraisa, zok the Ketzos HaShulchan, it's not possible that the Rambam wouldn't have specified that the din is only limited to a case where the brichas hamazon would not be a shayla b'deraisa. But the Mishnah Berurah is arguing in Svar. It's only a davar that it's not davar she'ein roi la'achila. It's only something that's nigra michashivusoi. So how then do we understand why there shouldn't be a brichas hamazon deraisa? Zot the Ketzos HaShulchan va'kusha shel Mishnah Berurah bekalish liyashiv. The afa pisha achila al yedei adchak shmo achila le'inyan bracha. It doesn't just depend if one can put the item is still intact enough that it's considered a ma'aseh achila. It has to satisfy the criteria of lechem. Why don't we make a bracha on something that's amazing and has the same nutritional value as pas, something which we discussed in the sugya pas abba kisnin? Ve'einu nikra lechem elu kshuroi la'achila b'lo yitchak. Eretz asher b'shaloi b'miskenes toicha b'lechem means there's a chashivus to a ma'aseh achila of lechem, and birchas hamazon is a shvach for that achila. It's a tzura, correct? Tzura sapas. He says, "Masha'inkin hapas she'ipsho ve'einu nechelas rak al de'adchak hokamino shem lechem." This is the all-important word. It's not just chashivus. It's that because it's me'upesh, it no longer has the status of lechem. And he says, I'll show you, v'gam harei lechem shebishlu ad she'ena prusais kezayis, gam ken potem mebirchas hamazon, and this is what Rabbi Bak was saying, lefi she'en toyar lechem olav. Lechem has the unique status of requiring toyar lechem. U'pas she'ipshov gam ken mishtane toyar lechem, K'moitavshil she'ovro tzurosoi de besomuch de chodom milsi. Tavshil she'ovro tzurosoi, the lashon of the Braisa, ovro tzurosoi means it's become a little bit. What should we say? In Yiddish, the expression is fashimol. It's become perhaps a little. I don't know if it's as much as that, but in short, it's no longer in its usual. It doesn't have its usual texture, its usual constituency. So therefore, it's considered something which is nishtane. Zot the Ketzos HaShulchan. What the svar of Pasha Ibsha isn't because of Hashivus, it's because it's lost its toya. Mevur that in the Bir Halacha and the Ketzos HaShulchan are mechulek in how to understand this svara of this din of Pasha Ibsha. What does nishtane mean? Does nishtane merely mean it lost Hashivus? Or does the nishtane mean it's actually undergone a physical transformation? The Bir Halacha says It's Nechal Adei Adchak, it just loses Chashivit, but it has a full Torah of Lechem. So the Ktseis HaShulchan, it lost its Torah of Lechem. Now the Shulchan Aruch, the Ktseis HaShulchan compares that to the din of Tavshil She'over Tzurasa. That Tavshil She'over Tzurasa also is that same Svara that it no longer has, not just because it lost its Chashivas, but no longer has the din of. So now let's be ma'ayin in the din of, let's be ma'ayin briefly in the din of Tavshil She'over Tzurasa. So the lashon of the Gemara, the lashon of the Brisa was Tavshil She'over Tzurasa. Now in Kodshim, we have a lashon which is called Ibur Tzura. Tone Ibur Tzura. SUGYAS in Psachim, SUGYAS in Shavuos. It's Tone Ibur Tzura. So unfortunately I omitted from the Maramakomis, but the Rashash on this Gemara of Ovar Tzurosai, the Rashash says the following.
It's brought in the Rosh Hashanah.
Hatavshel she'ovar tzurasai, zokter nearly the farish. I would explain that to mean kimoy ibu tzura de bekol mokoim bashas, like the term ibu tzura, which we find all over in Shas. The pirush shetavar olav halayla, that it's gone through a night. Now that means that if one takes a bowl of soup, which is bracha would be bar priadama because of shlokos, and you leave it outside exposed overnight, the bracha becomes shahakoil. So we have another quiz question to ask. Ruvain eats a tabshil at 6 o'clock, and he makes a hadama, and Shimon eats at 6 o'clock a.m. and he makes a shahakol heichem mashkachaslo.
Doesn't it mean that it deteriorated overnight? Yeah. Not just the lina.
Went overnight.
That kutcha means doesn't matter what happened to it. It has to deteriorate in some way.
So the Rishash fears ice, and the Rishash says, and that's what we'll get to, Rosh Hashanah. And we'll see that there's a makar for this in a rash in Masechta Shvius. This is not just a Rishash, it's a rash in Masechta Shvius. It's Rishonim. Zok the rash, but what can I do? It says, Ulam botlo daiti neged atur Shulchan Aruch, Reish Sim and Reish Daled. It says, if we look in Shulchan Aruch, if you go back to the Shulchan Aruch on page 252, how is the Shulchan Aruch described Tavshil? The Shulchan Aruch says, Tavshil shenishtanet tzurasai v'iskalkel. The Shulchan Aruch uses the lashon of Rashi by noiv lois and adds it. Oh yeah, sure with pleasure. Yeah, sure with pleasure. Yeah, that's the same page. Yeah, thank you. So Zok the Rishash, the Shulchan Aruch seems to require an additional condition for Tavshil she'ovar tzurasai, which isn't just literal ibutzura of all over Shas, but it means also that it's niskalkel. But the Rishash says the simple reading of the Bryce is not like that. Tavshil she'ovar tzurasai means it went through a night. Davar Pella. So we find a Davar Nifla in the Das Torah of the Bejan HaRav in the beginning of Siman Reish Daled, where the Bejan HaRav says that there's a rash in Masechta Shvius. The rash in Masechta Shvius discusses a case of the Yerushalmi. The rash in Perek Ches of Shvius brings the Yerushalmi that a person who has peiros that are roy la'achila on Shvius, Kedusha Shvius obligates him to eat those peiros and not use them for any use that's not the optimal use of the pri. Anything that's roy la'achila has to be used optimally as a davar in a form of achila. So one of the cases that Yerushalmi says is we not to mechayev a person mitzad the din of Kedushas peiros Shvius to consume through achila. Yerushalmi brings two cases: has she'ipsha and Tavshil she'niskalkel tzurasai. Not over tzurasai, niskalkel tzurasai. But we have the lashon of kilkel. So over there, the Rash says, an amazing Rash, which the Bejan HaRav brings. He says that the lashon is Dehainu she'ovra olov linas laila. The case that the Yerushalmi is referring to of Tavshil she'niskalkel tzurasai. How do we define what kilkel tzura of a Tavshil means? Zot the Rash, what it means is overall of Linas Laila. And the Rash concludes, Zot the Rash, V'siyem, Diyesh mikan raya, de Linas Laila pegemes. there's an extensive discussion in the Rishonim when something has a din of noisin tam lifgam. We're all familiar when we ask a boss of the cholov shaila that we cook something milchis in a fleshik pot by mistake. The first question that the Rav asks is, was the pot used for hot fleshik in the last 24 hours? Right? It's a basic question. Why? Because basar after a me'es leis, after 24 hours, is called noisin tam lifgam. And when that is nivla into another tavshil, it doesn't asad the edit. Now, that extent of time of a me'es leis is a machlokes Rishonim. The Rishonim that learn that noisin tam lifgam requires a full me'es leis. Other Rishonim learn it's merely a linas laila. Zok the Rash, I have a raya that something becomes pogum after just going through a night, because we see in Peres Shvius that Ovrotzu Rosom is no longer something that requires the Peres Shvius to be eaten, and therefore we see it was nifgam. If we see it was nifgam, then it was nifgam on Linas Laila. 100%, yes, that's absolutely correct. You do not say on a be'en noisin tam lifgam, and if you want to, correct. So yes, it's true. The Rash is just trying to show that it underwent a process of pegima. Avada, if someone would take something be'en that had linas laila, of course, that's boss and mamish, is just showing that it already begins to be nifgam. So blias in a kli will become nifgam legamre. It's just showing that zman for pegam. But the etzem ha'ora, Shalom Shadron in the Hagor, later on, it's going to be ma'ayin in the Das Torah inside, page Kuflam Tesan on, it discusses your shayla. But the Kipshuta, the Rash is just proving that the process of pegima sets in already after a laila. So the Marsham is showing a Yerushalmi. That Yerushalmi is mavur that after Linas Laila, a tavshel of Peres Shvius becomes pogum to the extent to Niskalkel, in the Lashon Yerushalmi, correct, thank you. In the Lashon Yerushalmi, it's tavshel Niskalkel to Rasai, and that's a me'es leis. So Reb Shalom Shvadron found in the margins of the Bejana Rov's Yerushalmi, that on that Yerushalmi in Shvius, and he quotes this in the footnotes, the Bejana Rov wrote the same inference from the Yerushalmi, and he wrote like this. He says, Ein Barash. If you look in the Rash explains that Yerushalmi says there's something called Tavshel Sheneshkalku Tzirosei Dahainu She'ovra Olav Linas Laila. Ulefizeh, says the Marasham, Behoda Oirachayim Reish Simon Reish Dalid, the Ein Levarich Olav Ela Shahakoil, Gamkenu, Dim Over Olav Linas Laila, Ein Levarich Shahakoil, Veloy Nizkar Dover Zebachaiskim. Because we don't find that a tavshel is left out overnight, then it loses its bracha. And then he says that the Marsham fears Zais, and he says v'ayin b'Reshash lebrachos daf memon lebeis. He says the ikar din I found in the Reshash. So Zot the Marsham, it's a pella the poskim don't mention it, but the Reshash says like that misvara den afshei, and I found the Yerushalmi. Now,
the Rash.
So Zokt and the Rishon Shadron is marich on this chiddush of his grandfather, of the Das Torah. But the one thing that he points out is that the Rash remains a Rash, is that Al Korchoch, we're not of our Laila, like what you pointed out, doesn't create pegima legabe any dinim of Kol HaTorah Kula Kipshuto. It's be'en. Vaistachois, we see a chiddush nifla here in the Rash, that this is a svara b'negeya to, is this considered the primary way to consume the meichel? Ad kedei kach that in Peres Shvius it maybe isn't considered something that's entirely darkei lechel anymore. Memele, we see from this Rash, and this is what Rav Shalom Shadron points out behemshech, that the din of our Gemara of Nishtana Lekilkul doesn't denigrate the object in itself, just because it's not in its pristine form that the derech would to eat it. So the same way as Lagabe Peres Shvius, it's no longer Mechayev Achila, it doesn't have the chashivos of something to make a bracha. But the object itself is intact, nothing changed be'etzem. Linas Laila. Lagabe Noisin Tam Lefgam, we don't say that on be'en bechlal. Elamai, we see that it's a very subtle svara, that just for Linas Laila, which the Shalom Shadron goes on to say, that just for Linas Laila, it should denigrate bracha. But in the Rashi, it's more that way. Al karchach, kol zman it loses its chashivas avachila, it loses its chashivas of bracha, and that's very close to the svar of the Bir Halacha. But again, to pascha ipsha, that in Chanami, the svar is just because it lost somewhat of the chashivas. So that the Ketzeis HaShulchan said in the parentheses, that pascha ipsha has to be that the pas became transformed in its toyar and it lost toyar lechem b'chule b'chule. And he says, where do I see that? Because I see that from Tavshil Sha'avra Tzurasai. In Tavshil Sha'avra Tzurasai Gufa, it's a mevucha gedola. What exactly Tavshil Sha'avra Tzurasai means? What does niskalkel mean when the Shulchan Aruch says it? Does niskalkel mean it became in some way spoiled? Or does niskalkel merely mean since it's already a process of pigam sets in, it's not considered entirely the derech to be oichel and therefore loses somewhat of its darga of chashivas.
Somewhat a type of shleik derech achila.
It's not derech achila even of kol atera kula, but akaponim in the legate to the din of shvius, perish shvius, we see it's not entirely davar shedarke lecha. Davar nifla that we find in the davar nifla that we find in the Rash. Just to mention again, a possible nafkimina ladina, taking that a step further. Again, from the ha'aris of Reb Shlomo Zalman. Shlomo Zalman discusses a case of what would happen if too much salt or too much sugar was put in the recipe. So the taste is not what it should be. It's either too salty or too sweet, to the point that it becomes more than noticeable, becomes less pleasant. Does that satisfy the criteria of Tavshil Sha'avra Tzurasai or not?
More than less pleasant. It's mashma, but it's not edible.
That's his case. How do we look at that? So if the Rosh Zalman is quoted on the right-hand side of the Marmakemis on page 2, the very last column, Zot Rosh Zalman, near it, something which has too much salt that anyone would consider to be a recipe that was mekulkal, a yoisem midai sukar, or too much sugar. Quotes from a Friedrich Sefer, not such a well-known Sefer, from Sefer Avodas Zarah, that it depends on whether or not it's only nechal adei. So in Tavshil Sha'avra Tzurasai, according to the Rash, we saw it doesn't have to be only not nechal adei adchak, it has to be akaponim that it's not the ordinary derech to be oikol it in that state. Shlomo Zalman says if it's not nechal adei adchak, that would be sufficient in order that the bracha should go down to become a shakol. That's where in that case, Shlomo Zalman is saying it doesn't depend on objectively whether or not the recipe isn't as tasty as it should be. He says it has to be towards whether or not it will be nechal adei adchak, or the meiste people would eat it. That's Shlomo Zalman's hachrach. Now and with this we'll finish, let's take this a step further to the din of the Mishnah, and it's in the din of the Mishnah of noivlos. Noivlos, we said, the maskon of the Gemara is bishulei chamra, which means, the way Rashi explains, it means the fruit that's been burnt on the tree, and therefore the ripening has been arrested, it's been stopped. And the bracha on that, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav explained, because it underwent a process of kilkul, and it can no longer ripen naturally on the tree, therefore the bracha is shahakol.
More than that, Masha, it's burnt from the sun, it makes the shtickle not edible, no?
So we're going to see if you say that varm is because it's not nechal or because the pri wasn't nigmar. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav is mashma that the issue is because the pri wasn't nigmar legamre and can't be based on the chama. But if you have time, maybe we'll touch on that later. In kol atera kula, wherever we need a din pri, bushlei chamra lacks a din pri, or this is a svara legabe bracha daf. Again, we could be tailored this on the same shayla. If the issue is because it's niskalkel be'etzem, and therefore it's nishtane as an object, possibly the gabi kol atera kula, it won't have the din of pri. If it's a svara dafka that kilkul or something that isn't derech, like Mishbura says, it lost its chashivos, then yesh lodun that the gabi kol atera kula, it may have a din of pri. So just to mention the Maramakim briefly, we find the machlokes harishonim brought in the beginning of the halachas of Orla in Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, where the Mechaber brings the following case. The Mechaber says that in the case of Tmorim she'enon misbashlim, top left of page 2, towards the end of the Mechaber, Tmorim she'enon misbashlim, v'ha'anovim sheloku ve'ei nigmarim bebishulam. So tamarim which are not further ripening, and anovim shalaku, anovim that became laka means in some way the ripening stopped. Ve'eni gemarim bebishulam, and they're not going to finish their ripening. Kulam chayovim ba'arla, they are chayav ba'arla, upturim miravai, and there's no din of neta revai. V'yesh misha oiser tmorim she'ino misbashlim af b'revai. So we have a machlokes rishonim about a din called tmorim she'ino misbashlim. Tmorim whose ripening has stopped. What is their din b'negeh to revai? So arla l'kulei alma, the machlokes is l'gabi revai. So the Shach and Ois Dawud explains what's the difference between Arla and Revai. Zok the Shach, the Beneta Revai Ksiv period. By Neta Revai, we need pre. The Loi Ksiv S, or recall from the Gemara and Daf Lamed Vav, the S, the Darshinon pre Atapoide, the Loi She'enai pre. Arla has a ribui of S that's in Maribah some things that will not have a Shem pre L'ger Benegeh to Neta Revai, but will satisfy the criteria of S period Benegeh to Arla. In short, what's relevant to our discussion is that Neta Revai requires a Shem Pri. So now, what are these Tamarim She'enam Mizbashlim? That there's a machlokes rishonim. So there's a machlokes between the Bach and the Shach. The Bach says that the machlokes is by Tamrei de Zika, time that fell off the tree. And the Shach says, no, even Tamrei de Zika, the Yesh Oyimrim holds that Neta Revai applies to. Even Bushlei Kamra, I'm sorry. Let me repeat myself, I apologize. The Bach says that the discussion of the Shulchan Aruch is Tamri de Zika, just Tamarim that fell off, not Tamarim that were burned. Tamarim that simply didn't finish their development on the tree. The Shach says in Avada that even the Shita that says that Tamarim She'enam is Bashlan have a din of Revai is talking about Bushlei de Kamra, even those that are Nisraf and will not finish could not finish their development on the tree. Now, it's an extensive discussion where the Shach brings many, many proofs for Loi Kahabach. The point that's relevant to us is what the Shach says at the end, the third underlying part of the Shach. We'll just see the lashon of the Shach briefly. Zok the Shach, Mimashakosu HaGoinim, that we find that the Goinim give us a klal. Midelegabi orlo lav pri le'inyan bracha nami loy mevarchin b'repro eitz. That the bracha b'repro eitz and pri legabi orlo go together. So therefore, if we see that bushlei the chamra, their bracha is shehakoil, then they can't have a shem pri legabi orlo and not legabi neta revai. Zok the Shach ein raya. Why? Because he says, I can show you mafurish in the Rishonim that the din of revai applies. And he says, Afa gabdele inyan bracha kaimelon de mevarchim shehakoil, even though legabi bracha shehakoil eliyah shloimar. My deloy have a peri legabe orla vaday loy mevarchim b'reprio eitz. That way around is true. What's not a pre legabe orla cannot have the bracha b'reprio eitz. Avol yesh loymar demaida have a pre leinian orla, something that could be a pre legabe orla. Mashkachas lo nami de mevarchim shehakol. Shehakol and bracha requires its own category of chashivas. Mimela zok the Shach avada bushlei the chamra pri legabe kol atayra kulo, even legabe neta revai. It's a specific svara that benegeh to the chashivas of bracha b'repro they don't have it. And the Bach Le'umasai says that if the bracha is sha'akol and bushlei the chamra, then in kol atayra kulo it doesn't have the shem of the pri. We have a very fundamental machlokes between the Shach and the Bach on this question. Is it possible to say that bushlei the chamra could have a din pri b'negeh to neta revai? The Bach says if we see the bracha sha'akol, it absolutely can't satisfy the criteria of pri. Now she'enken the Shach says it could be have a din pri. Gabi chashivas bracha, it doesn't have the din of pri. So just to finish, possibly we can discuss a shayla. What would be b'di'eved if one made on bushlei the chamra b'repro eitz? Now let's be clear. If bushlei the chamra didn't finally ripen, now they fell off the tree and just remained burnt, inedible, in a chanami, the bracha shakor. But there are rishonim that are mavur that bushlei the chamra, after they fall from the tree, can be ripened in an artificial way. There is a way to conclude the process of the ripening. So the Ktsois HaShulchan later, at the end of the Siman, establishes a machloikis between the Mogen Avram and the Panim Meiras. In the case of where bushlei the chamra finally ripen and become like ordinary fruit, if the bracha will then become back b'rei pri, or it will remain still shahakoil. Possibly bezen echleku. The Magen Avram's mashmos is that if the bracha is shahakoil, it remains always shahakoil, and therefore, if you make a bracha of b'rei pri, one can never be yotze. Masha'en kain the Badei Shulchan brings based on the Shari Tshuva upon a miras atchayil. It's possible to say that bezen nechleku again. If the yisoid of the bracha shahakol means it lost the chashivas of the chayfetz ba'etzem, and therefore even afterwards it will artificially ripen, it's mekulkal inherently, or do we say no? That's merely a svara that as long as it is mekulkal, it's not roy the bracha. But the moment where that kilkul is reversed, nothing happens to the object. And therefore, there may be a possibility of an afkimina b'negea to the bracha of b'rei pri. Right. So, yes, the answer to that is because there Rashi points out that the derech is to transform chitim into kemach and then to transform it into pas. So the interim mishtani l'greisa is only as long as it's just kemach. But adrabah, the kemach that's the conventional process that kemach should conclude with the nishtani lului of pas. Here, there's nothing inherent that says that bushlei the chamra are oimed to be ripened in that way. It's an artificial way of reversing the sreifas sachama, and therefore in that case we can't consider that as automatically it's nishtani lului.
Can we have a sikum?
Yeah. So let's summarize b'siyata d'shmaya the basic points of the limud. We began with a lashon of Rashi in the case of noivlois. That Rashi explained that noivlois, which the maskan of the Gemara means, in Rashi's definition, means those pears that have been burnt by the sun and therefore their ripening has been arrested. Rashi says Rashi's lashon is nishtanu l'kilkul. They were altered in a way of kilkul. And the basic chakira that we discussed was, what is the intent of Rashi with that? Does Rashi intend to mean that the point is like similar to Shtani L'Greisa, the object itself has changed and lost its status, and therefore its bracha changes? Or the idea is there's a specific chidush in the Gemara, which is called kilkul, and that is a new form of shinu which we haven't yet encountered. That kilkul itself is a reason why something is not royal bracha, even if the object itself is not considered to be inherently transformed. And we showed three areas in the sugya where this chakira may have ramifications and an afkimin. The first was in the chilukei deos between the Bir Halacha and Reb Chaim Noah and the K'tzais HaShulchan, in the case of when one ate pas she'ipsha to the shear of Kedei Svia, where the Birchas Hamazon is deraisa. The Bir Halacha said in that case, the pas, having a bracha of shakol just means it doesn't have its full chashivos. But in terms of pas, it's absolutely lechem, and therefore should be mechayiv a bracha of shalosh deraisa. And on that, K'tzais HaShulchan was chaylik, and he said the stima of the Rambam and all the poskim is not that way, and the bracha shal achrav will remain boyer nefashos, not even in shalosh. And the reason for that is because it's lost toyar lechem, similar to pascha bishul. The K'tzais HaShulchan drew an analogy to tavshel sha'ovar tsurosai, which has been altered in its mitzios, and we showed siyata d'shmaya from the Das Torah that the definition of ovar tsurosai is a machlokes harishonim, where the Rash in Masechta Shvius shows from the Yerushalmi, is mefarish in the Yerushalmi, that ovar tsurosai merely means it went through linas laila, which of course doesn't affect the etzem mitzios of the pashal. It just makes it not the usual derech to eat. It doesn't have the full chashivas of the davar hanechal. And that was the chiddush of the Rash, which the Rishash was mechaben to in Svara, based on a simple reading of the lashon of the Brisa of Atzurasai. And the third machlokes, which we discussed, is the din of noivlois, the machlokes between the shach and the bach. If noivlois entirely doesn't have a shem pri legabe kol hatera kula, or is merely a svara legabe bracha, but in kol hatera kula it will even have the din of netar avai. And we discussed the suffix of the K'tzais HaShulchan, who is toiler this and possibly on a machlokes between the Magen Avraham and the Panim Meiras. If bushlei the chamra, if they then become fully ripened, so they are in form similar to ordinary peri, what would be the din benegea to b'rei pri ha'etz? Just to end with Divrei Agada, the Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga brings the halacha that for the 6 days after the Yontiv of Atzeres, so 7 days, including the Yontiv of Atzeres, is considered tashlumim for Atzeres. Atzeres has tashlumim kol shiva, which means for a full 7 days, including the Yontiv of Atzeres itself, has tashlumim. The day in which the tashlumim of shiva from the Yontiv of Atzeres, the Raisa, concludes today. Today is Yud Bei Sivan. That's the day 7, where Vav Sivan will be the first day, and Yud Beis will be the 7th. So today ends the period of Atzeres having tashlumim kol shiva. Bizmanenu, where Bizman Shecharav HaMikdash, the main nafkamina we have from this halacha is those who have a minhag not to be noifel apayim all shiva yomim afterwards, as is brought by the Neisik Elim of the Shulchan Aruch in HILCHOS Nefilas apayim. Another nafkamina that's touched upon by the Chok Yaakov in HILCHOS Pesach, a Dover Pele, that he says, if someone didn't make a shechionu on Shavuos for the Yom Tov, he can make shechionu for a whole 6 days afterwards. As I state in Chok Yaakov. On that, there's a piece of Teres Rafal from Rafal Volozhiner, where Rafal Volozhiner says, Avada, it's not like the Chok Yaakov, because he says, since these are not Yomim Hasurim B'Malacha, they don't have the same Kedusha Sayayim as Atzeres, and one cannot. It's Kedai just to also mention a Davar Nifla that's in war in the Tshuvas of Rabbi Shualev Diskin. And he's Mesupik, can one still be Mekayim the mitzvah of Lahakbo Pnei Rabbi Berega in the 6 days that remain after Shavuos? What's the aside of the Suffolk? The aside of the Suffolk is that the Neidim Yehuda and Tshuva writes, Davar Nifla, that the reason why there is a din of Lahakbo Pnei Rabbi Berega, it's a Neidim Yehuda. He says, because in each day that there's Musaf, there's an additional Kedusha that's Shefea al Rabbi, Machmas Kedusha Sayoim, and therefore the Rav will be Mechadish greater Kedusha Torah, and the Chiv Lahakbo Pnei Rabbi Beregel is to hear that additional Darga of Torah that's Chal on the Rav. This is a Tshuva Neidim Yehuda. So Memele, the Yeshli Stafik, even if it's not Yom that have Musafim, but Yomim that have still the korbanos of the regel, does that create that same darga of or being shefeya? But Shiva Yomim, Atzeres has tashlumim kol Shiva, which ends today.
So today's shir came from that extra or hashefa.
That the island can decide.
That's how we're all here.
that the island can decide. If it was good, maybe. If not, let it not be a steer to the Nevi'udas decide. Homios, just to conclude. It also happened is today is the Yud Beis Sivan is the yard site of one of the Gedolei Talmidim of the Briskirov, Reb Chaim Aaron Turchin, the Mechaber of the Sefer Kunshas Chanukah Megillah, the Sefer Masechia, and the Gedolei Talmidim of the Briskirov, who Leichem was nifter relatively young. And given that this is the last day of the Yomim in which we still hold on to the Chag of Atzeres, perhaps it would be kedai to mention the Davar Nifla that he writes in the Hagdama to his Sefer Masechia Chelek Beis to explain a very puzzling Lashon Rambam that a number of Achronim discuss. That the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah in Perek Aleph says Chayav Adam Milmei Torah ben Oni ben Osher etc. etc. He says Afilu Sosa Kaidem Isosa, a person that's still Chayav to be oisik in limud HaTorah, based on the Gemara in Shabbos. La'olam la'yilma nimna adam atzim shal achas misamedrash afilu samach l'misasa. The Achronim ask, is samach l'misasa yet patur in any other mitzvahs HaTorah? What state down Rambam? So before what Reb Chaim Aaron says, it's perhaps kedai just to mention a Meshech Chochma in the end of Parshas Vayera. But the Meshech Chochma in the end of Parshas Vayera touches on this Rambam. And he says that a person could think that the Ikatayalas of Torah is Borossi Yitzhahara, Borossi Torah Tavlin. Adam Roya Sheyitzrim is Gabarolov, one of the eights is in Shechayel Beis HaMedrash. The Ikatayalas of Torah is to be mashbis from the Adam, his Yitzhahara. Says a person who's Samachim Misasa, Yadarabba is being Mechashiv Cheshbon Shel Olam. The Yitzhahara doesn't speak to him, Bechlal. There is the Hasidim have a Messiah that Reb Uri Strelisker, sorry, Samachim Misasa, Talmidim asked him, "Was that the Yitzhahara jetzt?" And he said that the Yitzhara sagt, das Gearois mit das solche Kedusha und Teire und Islavus, als man soll sagen, als weg a Kaddish. Is a concept that the Yitzhara noch outzurennen. So steht in der Simcha. He says, therefore, a person may think there's no need now to be Isaac Batayr anymore. Because in Shultim V'yem Amavis. Zok there, the Kiddush of this memory of Chazal, this Psak of the memory of Chazal is that the matar of Torah is to be David Bo Yisbarach. And that's not what's in every single moment of a person. As Ezot Remei Simcha. A person should never lose sight. That's the limud of this Rambam and this Gemara. A person never should lose sight of the Mailah and that Torah brings him to. That's what Remei Simcha explains from the Rambam. Reb Chaim Aaron says that in the Ikar mitzvah of limud Torah, the mitzvah of Shinantam, she would return mechudadim beficha v'dibartamam. The seder of the psukim is very difficult. What's the connection between Kabbalas Umm Shemayim, Ava, and Limud Torah? So Chaim Aaron says like this. He says in his beautiful lashon, he says, "Ruchnius hudavar odin." It's very edel. It's very subtle. So the metzius of a person is that Maila that a person has belibo, that darg of Ava, Yiro, Dveikos, is fragile. A person loses it very, very easily. He says, what is it that creates that even in instances and at times when a person isn't able to actively invigorate that Ava and Yiro that's beliboy, what maintains his madrega ruchnis? What maintains a yid in a constant state of a HaHav Hashem Elokecha b'chol ha'vavcha v'nashchem mideh? The answer is v'choyu hadvarim eila she'anechi mitzav chayim al livavecha. Ava is balev. What maintains that darga of balev is divrei Torah. The reason why la'olam la'yilma yimna adam atzmi beis medrash afilu sha'achas isn't just because Talmud Torah is a chiyuv b'chol rega v'rega. That's pshita. That's no different than mitzvahs lulav or mitzvahs matzah if that's the zman or whatever else the mitzvah timidus is. The Yesod Advarim La'olam La'yilma Adam in Beis HaMedrash Afilu Sha'achas is because an Adam maintaining his darga and avon yira depends on Torah being believed by Korega Varega. That's what it depends on. Memela, that's the hemshech. V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol ha'vavcha, Kabbalas oil, Emunas hayichud, ava, yira, dveikos, all those madregas. How? V'hoyu Advarim Eila Sh'nechim Mitzav Chayim Al Vavecha. The kol rega v'rega of Divrei Torah is not just the kol rega v'rega of being Isaac in the technical mitzvah of Isaac HaTorah. It's maintaining the tzur of the Adam. That's what he writes in Akdama. It's kedai to be ma'ayin in the L'shenis Nefloim. It's printed in Akdama to my Sechir Chelik Beis, the very last piece in Akdama. Comes to be mefarish this Rambam. So Homias in this last of the Shiva Yomim of Tashlumim of Atzeres, where the Yisod Advarim is obviously we understand that if in some way, some of the oil in the kedusha and the madrega of Atzeres is being preserved and given to us for an additional shisha yomim besides the yom of Atzeres. Another opportunity to be mischazik, to preserve, to maintain, to invigorate our dveikus in Eisek HaTorah and to be zeiches through that.